Hello, and welcome to Building Solidarity Through Global Stories. My name is Sarah DeMarais, and I work at Loyola University, New Orleans. I'm going to start here by introducing myself. I have taught elementary and middle school in the Archdiocese of New Orleans. I've also served kids in New Orleans as a middle school mental health counselor, working with kids who have experienced trauma and violence. I've worked with high school youth in a residential nonprofit here. And I've also partnered with a girls' vocational school in Uganda for students who didn't have the financial resources to go to a traditional high school. And all those experiences led me to my current work at the Loyola Institute for Ministry, or LIM. At LIM, I manage projects that provide theological education for Catholic sisters in Eastern and Southern Africa, with a focus on Catholic social teaching. I help our students to grow in their understanding of this rich social tradition in our church, to inspire action on behalf of integral human development, sustainability, and particularly care for vulnerable youth. So throughout all these experiences I just described, I've been really concerned with questions of how we can foster compassion and care across difference. I've seen the ways that my students, my clients, suffer due to a lack of compassion from people or from structures and systems that allow for poverty, marginalization, and environmental injustice. I've seen how a lack of solidarity harms the whole human family and the earth. So my thesis here today is this: stories can transform us towards solidarity. I'll talk more about what I mean by solidarity, but I want to start with this frame from Pope Francis. Francis writes that educators are called to helping people through effective pedagogy to grow in solidarity, responsibility, and compassionate care. So this session is going to offer some resources for you to achieve that in Catholic classrooms and different educational spaces. I hope you're tuning in from a whole range of ages. That's why I described my experience from elementary to higher ed. I really think this is relevant for everybody. So I hope this session can inspire some efforts guided by the commitments of Catholic social teaching. And I'm hoping this session can take a global lens and really strive to honor the diversity and complexity of the human family. To be more specific about what we're doing here today, here's our learning objectives. By the end of this session, I hope that you will be able to understand these Catholic social teaching concepts of solidarity and integral ecology and how they challenge students today, and to design and implement learning experiences to help your students to grow in commitment to action in solidarity with the global poor and with creation. So how we're going to do this, I'm going to share a whole bunch of stories to illustrate how stories can lead us to greater solidarity. We're going to explore these concepts of solidarity and integral ecology and explore the implications of those for you and for your students. I'll share ideas for how to use stories to promote solidarity, including through service learning. We'll watch a powerful example of a film about a community affected by HIV/AIDS in Kenya. And I'll share actually some lesson plans that you could adapt for your class to use that video to teach solidarity through stories. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with my contact information and a link to a collaborative tool where you can see all the resources I'm sharing here today and add some of your own. And I hope you will be inspired to share some of your own ideas and your own stories and resources for sharing stories as well. So it seems appropriate, since I'm claiming that stories lead us to solidarity, to start with my own story. So when I was growing up, my mom worked in campus ministry at a Catholic university. So I started going on college service trips at a very young age, including several trips to Tijuana, Mexico, starting when I was in third grade, which looking back at now seems completely wild. parenting decision, but that's what we did. And it was amazing for me. I was able to travel with these college students and volunteer with Esperanza International, which is committed to building homes and community building in a spirit of solidarity and helping volunteers grow into an understanding of themselves as global citizens. So I had these really powerful experiences at a very young age of encountering people with totally different experiences from my own, but encountering them as full persons with rich stories. And if you're thinking, this sounds like a very stereotypical college admissions essay right now, you are absolutely right. And this was certainly my college admissions essay, but I'm not trying to get, to sell myself to a university right now. That's not why I'm sharing this. I'm sharing this as an example of how a transformation of heart can start at whatever age and resonate for years and years and years. So through these trips, I learned, of course, about poverty, about harms caused by border and immigration policies, but I also encountered people. I learned their stories. I learned about their joys, their families, their communities, and their faith. And those stories still resonate for me. If I'm reading the news and I see immigrant or border, these are the stories that come to mind. Immigrants are not faceless for me. People experiencing serious global poverty are not faceless because of these stories and these relationships. This still shapes how I vote, how I communicate with elected officials. Though I will say my fourth grade letter to President Clinton did not seem to have much of an impact on our border or trade policy, but I'm going to keep trying. It affects how I donate, how I volunteer, and how I treat people. My understanding of myself as a person in a global human family was shaped by the stories of people that I encountered here. Now to turn to a more recent story. The southeastern coast of Africa was recently hit by Cyclone Anna. And some of the communities served by our students were devastated. But it was very hard for me to find news about what was happening because this just really wasn't covered much in Western media. But I was so struck by this message I got from a student, including some of these pictures. She said, "See what is happening here." She wanted me to witness to the experiences and the suffering of people in her community. If I had just been scrolling through the news or through social media and seen a headline, Cyclone Anna hits Malawi, I probably would have kept moving and not thought about it much. But this sister forced me into an encounter with these stories, these human lives that are affected. And to illustrate how this kind of encounter with a story can move one to solidarity, rather than doing nothing as I might have done if I had only encountered a headline about this, I'm now partnering with that sister to write a grant where she can get some relief funds to support her ministries and the basic needs of the communities affected by this disaster. So, with those stories in mind, that I hope illustrate how we can move from an experience of relationship or story into action, let's dive into Catholic social teaching. So, at the root of our understanding of solidarity is the idea that everything is interconnected, everything is interdependent. Pope Francis says not even subatomic particles can be considered in isolation. So you can think about something like climate change and how it's affected by people all over the world and the complexity of that. But there's so many ways that we can't even begin to understand because they're so mysterious that we are interconnected, that what one person does affects everyone. And in the Catholic theological tradition, we actually see this interconnection reflected in the Trinity. So here Francis says the reality of interconnection invites us to develop a spirituality of that global solidarity which flows from the mystery of the Trinity. Let's break this apart a little bit. In the Trinity, we have three equal persons in one triune God, interconnected. None are subordinate, though the Holy Spirit does tend to get marginalized a little bit in the Catholic imagination. The Holy Spirit is not subordinate. None are subordinate. These three persons coexist in a dynamic of communion, of love, of mutuality. And as human persons, we are created in the image of this triune God. We most fully image God through community, through relationships, when relationships are just, when they're characterized by love and by mutual care. Where humans are creating exclusion or marginalization, we fail to live up to this call to image the triune God, to participate in divine love. So the Trinity, the mysterious, beautiful Trinity, is the foundation of our understanding of solidarity. But what is solidarity? What does it mean? What does it look like? It is a really challenging idea. It's challenging to understand, let alone to live out. And the closest thing that we have to a definition is from Pope St. John Paul II. He writes that solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of people. Rather, solidarity is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. So you can see how the idea that we're responsible for all flows out of this recognition of interdependence and our aspiration to follow the model of the Trinity. The contribution of John Paul was to think of solidarity not only as an attitude or a duty, but as a virtue. It's something we can cultivate. We can continue to grow in solidarity, to grow in our determination to advance the common good, in recognition of our responsibility for all. If you take a second and think about how radical that is, that you are responsible for people that you will never meet, that may be on the other side of the world. You will never encounter them, but you are connected with them and you are responsible for them. That's this challenge we're offered by this beautiful tradition of Catholic social teaching. Another idea I want us to spend some time with is integral ecology. So Pope Francis loves the word integral. He says, to integrate is a verb very dear to me. When you think about integral, think about things coming together towards wholeness. So integral calls us to wholeness, to fullness. You'll hear Francis talk about integral human development and integral ecology. So ecology is about the relationship between organisms and the environment. So an integral ecology, an ecology that's really whole and full, will respect that there are human and social dimensions to the environment. Francis says, we are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach. So you can imagine how at these high levels of trying to integrate and not think of the environment as something completely disconnected from humanity, how that would have implications for things like national environmental policy or international climate accords. But Francis challenges us by saying each of us is called to embody an integral ecology in our own lives. What does that look like? Integral ecology is made up of simple daily gestures which break with the logic of violence, exploitation, and selfishness. So you could think maybe of a consumer who buys whatever they want, whatever they feel like, without any regard for the environmental and human impact of that consumption, that participates in systems of violence and exploitation. Instead, we are called to act out of peacefulness, selflessness, and solidarity. Our daily choices should be made in recognition of our interdependence. So we're going to take a few minutes here for reflection. I'm going to have some think time built into the video, but if you want more, you are welcome to pause and spend as much time on these questions as you like. I want you first to think about yourself. How are you living out solidarity and commitment to integral ecology? Have you had any experiences? Can you think of a time that you felt really responsible and determined to connect with someone, to help someone, maybe on the other side of the world or that you might not ever meet? What moves you to feel that sense of solidarity? So after you spend some time thinking about yourself and how you as an educator might model solidarity and a commitment to integral ecology, think about your students. What do you hope for them with regards to solidarity and integral ecology? I encourage you to think about in the short term. You could even write down some lesson objectives. What do you want your students to be able to do, know, understand at their current developmental level? What could they do now to grow in these areas? But then also think about the long term, about what kind of people you want them to become. So go ahead and take some time to think about these questions. Welcome back. I'm sorry we're not together in person or at least synchronous to be able to share our reflections with one another, but I do hope you took some time to think about what this might look like for your unique students in your community. So my big idea here, as I said at the beginning, is that we can do this through stories. So I want to point to a couple other stories, a couple other examples of people who do this well. First, you may be familiar with Humans of New York. I was telling my coworker about my idea for this, and she said, "That sounds exactly like Humans of New York." And she was absolutely right. Humans of New York started as a photography project, just taking pictures of people on the street in New York. You may have seen it. It's often a picture and then a story. And it's just a glimpse into people's lives. But these stories are so rich and they honor the dignity of every person. This project has really grown. The photographer now travels all over the world. He's featured thousands of stories from 40 different countries. And these stories do often move people towards solidarity, towards taking action. Humans of New York says they've actually fundraised over $20 million to help people, including, for example, there was a series about the refugee crisis in Europe that raised a lot of money in support of refugees. Another example of how stories can move people to solidarity is if you're in a Catholic high school or college, you have probably heard or been assigned Tattoos on the Heart. These are 3 books by Father Greg Boyle, a Jesuit priest who serves with Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. And these books are full of stories of Father Greg's encounters with gang members. And what I find so powerful, and what I think so many people find so powerful about these, is it's just story after story after story that humanizes gang members, and that give you a glimpse into people's lives um, that, at least for me, are very different from my own life and lead me to a more compassionate understanding of these people and their life experiences. And so many people have been inspired by these books to volunteer, whether in Los Angeles, or to change how they treat people in their own communities who might be on the margins. So, with those examples in mind of some different stories that have really transformed people's hearts and led them to action and solidarity, let's think about the stories that you and your students are encountering. Whose stories are heard in your classroom and in your school community? Whose stories are not heard in your classroom and your school community? This could look a lot of different ways. I know some Catholic schools might do a really good job of international education and pointing to the needs of people on the other side of the world, but then not do a great job sharing the stories of people in need in their own local areas. Or you might only be hearing stories from dominant groups and not from diverse racial and ethnic groups. Do you hear the stories of people with disabilities? Do you hear the stories of Indigenous people? Do you hear the stories of people with different experiences of gender and sexuality? Think about whose voices your students are hearing and whose they're not. Francis says, we need to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, hearing those together. Remember, integral ecology, we're not thinking about the earth as one thing and humanity or the poor as another, but we're understanding this is a complex interaction, that we're called to care for human beings in solidarity, and also to be in solidarity with the natural world that needs our care, creation that needs our care. Have your students heard that call, the call of the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor in an integrated way? How? So take a few more minutes for reflection here. Welcome back. I hope you were able to identify some uh, voices that could be better heard by your students and by your school community. If you need more time, just pause the video before moving on. But for those of you who are ready to go, let's think about how we do this. How can we use stories? Once we've identified the ones that we need to hear, how do we use those to build solidarity? And I want to start by talking about you as the educator. You have so much influence on your students. So if you think about yourself, think about how you encounter stories, the news you consume, other media you consume, including even fictional stories. Do those sources increase your respect for human dignity? Do they recognize the complexity of human experience? Often, if I know for myself, if I'm just scrolling through social media and just getting snippets of things, those aren't deep stories. Those aren't stories that humanize, that help me really understand someone else's experience. I have to go a little bit farther, a little bit deeper to find the kind of stories that can move me into relationship, move me into solidarity. Do you encounter news that helps you understand integral ecology? How are you hearing the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor in an integral and a whole way? And then think about the stories of your students, their families, their communities. How do you listen to and honor those stories? Because you have a whole wealth of diverse stories right in your own community. Do you allow those stories? Do you listen to them and allow them to do work on your heart to strengthen your compassionate care of your students? And for your students, so here's where we get practical for our students. There are so many um, different stories and in different mediums. So you can get really creative with this. You can read different stories, obviously. So for little elementary school kids, that might be a read aloud with a picture book. For older students, they can be reading news articles. You can watch videos and films, listen to podcasts, listen to radio stories. So you can hear, you can read, you can watch different stories. There's even really cool data stories. I'll be sure to include one on the resources page that I'll share with you at the end, where you can see stories represented with kind of rich statistical or data backing as well. So those are, just think of those different mediums that you can use to share stories to help transform your students' hearts towards solidarity. And then maybe you'll identify some places, maybe you already did, where those stories are just unheard. There doesn't exist a book, a film, a radio recording for that story. Could your students go do interviews? Could they interview their family members, their community members, people in the school community, to draw forth stories that haven't yet been shared? And then can your students participate in storytelling, sharing their own stories, sharing the stories of others, not just consuming stories, but then also articulating it for themselves? You could even do like a Humans of New York style representation where students could share a picture and a brief story about someone whose voice might be underrepresented or about their own experience. These are all ways of um, breaking open our hearts to help us experience compassion for others. And that has to happen in your classroom community, um, or it should happen in your classroom community. And when students can experience that with each other, they will know better how to do that for people that they may never meet or encounter. So to show what this could look like, I'm going to share with you a video clip and a resource. As I have done, is a film created by Salt and Light Media, which is a Catholic media company. I was one of the consultants on this project because it involved actually a lot of our students, Catholic sisters in East Africa. So there's 3 30-minute episodes. Each of them focuses on a different way that Catholic sisters are contributing to sustainable development. So you'll see here the themes are justice and peace, equality, sustainability, and these are full of stories of the ways that sisters do this. And why I think these are such a rich resource for classroom communities is, for us in the United States, it's actually really challenging to find stories that humanize people in Africa, to not just represent them as objects of charity or as stereotypes, but to really represent their stories in their own voices. And I think that's what these videos do. So I want to share with you a clip about a sustainable community in Kenya that emerged out of the needs of communities affected by HIV/AIDS, particularly families where parents died from AIDS. So you have the grandparents and the children left behind. And so in this clip, you'll hear about an innovative solution to that challenge. And I hope that as you watch, you think about how the stories that you're hearing can move your heart towards solidarity and also towards integral ecology, because this is a really creative example of a project that advances human flourishing while also caring for creation.
About it. So he thought of this unique idea of a blended family. The two left behind generations we were needed to reach out to. Grandparents left behind to bring up their biological grandchildren, and the other left behind generation are families of children headed by the eldest in the family, trying to eke out a living. So we would invite them into a village which we started to build and ask them to take into the family groups from the child-headed households to make a family of approximately 10 children headed by a grandparent.
In this program, we have 100 families, and the capacity for the children in the village is supposed to be 1,000 and 100 grandparents. The responsibilities of raising these children are all bestowed on to this grandparent. She or he raises these children without discrimination. All children are equal when they are in the village.
The vision of the village is sustainable communities for children infected or affected by the HIV pandemic, inspired by Christian compassion. That's our spirit, Christian compassion.
Nane asiana ko no kia ko asiana. Ane mbula ni dress yo nda isi akwana ila siene. Asi nda no ndo mwe.
After my parents passed on, that was in 09, we were left with our grandmother. Now our grandmother struggled until we get the chance to come here in the village. And our main purpose of coming here in the village was just to study, because in our home, that's the original home, where we came from, we had nobody to care for us.
So I hope you enjoyed that brief clip. Again, this is a series of 3 30-minute episodes. So if you watched that snippet and thought, my students might find this really interesting, if you think it's an interesting way to show them the lives of people they might not otherwise encounter, you are in luck, because I'm going to share with you links to stream all 3 episodes for free. I also have a lesson guide that I created early on in the pandemic to help teachers who were abruptly transitioning to virtual learning, but you could use it virtually or in your classroom. It's perfect for high school teachers teaching a Catholic social teaching class, because it really focuses on how you could use these videos, these stories, as lenses for helping your students to understand and then to be inspired to better embody Catholic social teaching. So those resources will follow. I want to talk a bit about service learning, because we've looked at ways of sharing stories, telling stories in the classroom through diverse mediums. But another really popular way of building solidarity and encountering the stories of others is service learning. But service learning can be tricky. Service learning does not, or even service, I should say, service does not necessarily lead to solidarity. I want to share a story from this book by Dr. Megan Clark from St. John's University, from her book, The Vision of Catholic Social Thought, The Virtue of Solidarity and the Praxis of Human Rights. And I have to give credit to Dr. Clark for this whole book has really informed how I think about solidarity. But I wanted to share this section where she talks about a service learning experience that she had with students, college students who went for a service project to Bagaces, Costa Rica. So I'm going to read about kind of a long paragraph here, and I want you to be thinking about if you've ever experienced this yourself, something similar while doing service, or if your students, if you've done service with your students and they've had a similar focus. So let's hear Megan's story. She talks about how the community being served by this service project, this home building project, offered lunch, offered hospitality, really wanted to spend time with the volunteers. But the volunteers weren't too comfortable with that. She writes, "This was an element with which many of my students genuinely struggled. Uncomfortable with taking time or resources from the poor, they often manifested a laser focus on the concrete building task and experienced discomfort at eating the papayas the village women bought for us off the fruit truck. Solidarity, however, requires genuine mutuality and reciprocity in the relationship. I can come in and help you, but if the relationship is not one of mutual participation, then it will not be one of solidarity. Complete focus on the limited project of building a house provides insulation from the vulnerability, the questions, and the challenge posed by the reality of poverty." For Catholic social thought, the elements that make us as Americans anxious are absolutely crucial. The lunches hosted by the women were a major element of what made solidarity possible. Engaging the vulnerability and poverty through solidarity forced us to be vulnerable and to ask difficult questions about poverty in our own communities. Solidarity was made possible only through the vulnerability experienced when we realized our humanity is bound up with theirs. That experience generated an opening that draws us into relationship with those in poverty back home. Engagement through those lunches pushed us beyond seeing only what is lacking or making sharp judgments about the people we encountered and people facing poverty in our own communities. She concludes that commitment to solidarity is always grounded in the personal. Responding to human rights violations begins with the recognition of the other as an equal human being. As we respond in the interplay of these experiences locally and globally, we begin to build solidarity. How do I engage in a different context? How do I begin not with poverty, but with personhood? So that story of students who were so focused on building a house that they didn't even want to take time to have lunch with the people that the house was being built for and with, that's really challenging. And we should think about that when we're designing service experiences for our students. How can we design experiences that start with personhood? Experiences that help us to recognize the equal dignity, the full humanity of the other. Here are some of my thoughts on how we can do this. First, start with a story. Humanize the people, the communities being served. I think this is especially a great tool for maybe younger students who, or like in this time of pandemic where it's hard to go serve people in person, we might be making sandwiches for people or writing letters for people. You can still start with a story. For younger students, again, that could be a simple read aloud of a picture book. But don't ask your students to do service without first humanizing and sharing some of the richness of the people who will be on the receiving end of that. And then especially important when this is an in-person service opportunity, whether it's, a one-time thing or something like a week-long alternative spring break kind of design trip. Prepare your students before they go in for the ambiguity, complexity, and discomfort of interactions with other people. They should not be expecting, even having heard stories in preparation, they should not be expecting to fit the people they meet into particular boxes or for them to fulfill any particular stereotypes. Talk to them about being open to the wonder of encounter with another human being. And then after the service, share stories. What did they hear? What did they learn about people? What surprised them? What was like their experience or not like their own experience? And then as you're designing these opportunities, think about the dynamics of power and of privilege. We need to think about those things if we want service to contribute to genuine solidarity. It needs to be, all of our service learning experiences need to be rooted in this recognition of interdependence, of our need for mutual flourishing. Service should not be doing things for people, but participating in liberation with people. So these are my final reflection questions for you today. What do you want to do? I shared some ideas. What would that look like in your own classroom, in your own community? How could you use stories to build solidarity, to promote integral ecology for your students? If you jotted down some learning objectives earlier on in the presentation, maybe then write down some activities. So how are you going to do that? How can we listen to unheard stories? You identified some stories that have not been heard by your students. How can they hear those? And then in everything we do, whether that's classroom lessons or service learnings, how can we begin with personhood, not poverty? Not talking about social issues or environmental issues, but start with a recognition of the equal dignity of every human person, of the realities of interdependence. So take some time to think about your takeaways. What do you want to do after having watched this presentation? And after some reflection time, I'll conclude with a few resources. I hope that you're feeling inspired to put into action some of what we've talked about today. Let's wrap up. I would love, love, love to hear from some of you. I'm sorry we can't be doing this live where we could collaborate and share ideas and ask and answer questions together. But don't hesitate to contact me. You can DM me through this event platform, or perhaps better, send me an email, then we won't lose access to it. I'd love to hear your comments, your questions, your ideas for how you might do this in your own school communities. A bonus for people in New Orleans. If you are in the New Orleans area and you would find value in having your very own DVD of As I Have Done, send me an email and ask for it, and I will bring it to your school, because I've got a few of these that I would love to get into the hands of teachers who would like to use them. Even if you're not New Orleans, don't worry. I've got you set up with links where you can stream those videos for free, as well as lots of other resources. And those are all on Padlet. So if you type in this URL that you'll see here, I used a link shortener, but this link should bring you to the Padlet page that has a whole bunch of resources. If you're not familiar with Padlet, it's basically a collaborative bulletin board. So you, as someone who has participated in this session, are more than welcome to add your own contributions to that page. And I would love, love, love that. Maybe you have your own ideas for how this could be done. Maybe you have stories from your community that you want to be more broadly heard and recognized. Go ahead, add them to the Padlet. I hope we can get some really great ideas shared there. And I want to leave us here on a hopeful note, because solidarity is hard. It's hard to do. It's hard to foster the virtue of solidarity in ourselves, let alone in others, in our students. So here's a reminder from Pope Francis. For all our limitations, gestures of generosity, solidarity, and care cannot but well up within us, since we were made for love. So I hope you can trust that as your students encounter people, their stories, as they recognize their interdependence and relationships with others, it will lead to love, to care. We were made for this. We were made for solidarity with others. And as educators, we can create conditions for our students to live into this call to solidarity and integral ecology. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. God bless.